The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the concrete runway at Ramstein Air Base, creating waves of heat that distorted everything beyond 50 yards. Captain Rachel Ford walked slowly across the tarmac, her olive flight suit bearing the weathered creases of countless hours in the cockpit. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned every stripe on her sleeve the hard way. Her boots made no sound on the concrete as she approached her aircraft. The old clipboard, tucked under her arm, contained the same pre-flight checklist she had used for the past 15 years. Her weathered gloves swayed from her belt, fingertips darkened by oil stains that told stories of engines repaired in desert heat and mountain cold. To her left, two sleek European fighter jets taxied into position. Their pilots wore pristine flight suits with built-in cooling systems, their names embroidered in perfect lettering. Ground crews in mirrored sunglasses directed them with practiced precision, their equipment gleaming like parade props. The pilots never looked her way. They had no reason to. Rachel's aircraft sat alone at the far edge of the flight line, looking like a relic from another war. The Warthog's gray skin was dulled and pockmarked, streaked with rivet marks and stress-scored flaps that spoke of hard use and harder landings. The name Thunderchild stretched across the nose in faded paint that had begun peeling at the edges, revealing older white letters underneath. The maintenance crew gave her a respectful nod as she passed. They never asked questions about her solitary routine. She ran her pre-flight checks alone every morning, same as always. No orders came down for her anymore. No changes appeared on the mission board, but her fuel tanks stayed topped off and the tires held pressure. The massive cannon beneath her nose sat cold but ready. Near the operations tent, two younger pilots leaned against the wing of a Dutch fighter, laughing over something on a tablet. One looked up as Rachel passed, then smirked at his companion. "Still, keeping that museum piece warm?" he called out, just loud enough to be heard without having to repeat himself. Rachel didn't answer. She didn't even look their way. She had heard variations of that joke for months now. She walked past the edge of the parking line and into the shadow of her aircraft. Inside the cockpit, her helmet hung from its familiar hook. The matte black finish scuffed and dulled from years of wear. She left it there for now, reaching instead for the seat straps to check the buckles and adjust the thigh restraints. The harness felt like memory in her hands. The seat creaked under her weight but held firm. Her armrest bore a small scratch from a kneeboard latch, one she had put there during a mission over Kandahar years ago. She rested her hand there now without thinking about it. Behind her, the base loudspeakers crackled to life, calling crews to briefing for a northern corridor intercept scenario. Her name was not mentioned. Neither was her aircraft's call sign. She sat in the shadow of the Warthog's wing, opened her flight manual, and carefully tucked the edges of a photograph back into the inside flap. The image showed a younger Rachel, kneeling beside the same jet, one arm thrown around the nose cone, smiling without restraint. That was before the reassignment letters started coming, before the war ended and budgets thinned, before committee members in Washington labeled her aircraft type obsolete and cost prohibitive. The airfield around her pulsed with routine efficiency. Cargo handlers moved sleek drone components across the strip while a European fighter banked hard into the clear sky, vapor trails streaming from its wingtips. Somewhere near the operations tent, laughter burst and faded again, the sound echoing off hangar walls that seemed to have forgotten her name. Voices carried from the far end of the hangar row. A logistics officer in pressed khakis was briefing a younger technician, his voice light but clear. He pointed once toward the Warthog, then turned back to his checklist. "That one's up for decommission next quarter," he said matter-of-factly. "Paint's too far gone, and it's not worth the avionics refit." Rachel didn't move from her seat. She closed her flight manual slowly, then opened her logbook instead. She turned one page, drew a line through the last weather notation, and began copying coordinates from memory. Wind speed, terrain profiles, emergency return vectors. She wrote without looking down, her pen moving with practiced certainty. The massive cannon remained silent beneath her feet, but the aircraft was not empty. Neither was she docked by mid-morning. The main hangar buzzed with clipped voices and radio chatter that spoke of efficiency and progress. Digital maps glowed across tablet screens, updated in real time from satellite feeds that could track a sparrow's flight path. Flight crews crowded into briefing tents, their equipment spotless, their movements choreographed by months of joint training exercises. A French flight leader stood at the corner whiteboard, explaining intercept formations in a voice that expected immediate compliance. Every NATO nation had sent someone with perfect posture and flawless protocol. The future of aerial warfare was sleek, fast, and digital. Rachel Ford was not called to these briefings. She stood near the auxiliary maintenance pad, half in shadow, adjusting a generator cable beneath her Warthog's left wing. The ground power unit hummed quietly beside her boot, its static making the fabric of her sleeve tingle. Her kneeboard rested on the wing, clipped with a paper checklist and a folded map from Afghanistan, printed years ago with faded contour lines and a grease crease down the center dot to her right. 3 ground technicians helped load electronic countermeasure pods onto the tail of a Polish fighter. Their movements were crisp and confident, backed by computer systems that could diagnose problems before they occurred. One of them glanced in her direction and gave a polite nod before returning to work. The gesture held no mockery, just the professional distance of duty. Inside the ready room, the mission board blinked to life with digital precision. Lines filled rapidly with call signs, altitudes, and departure windows. Advanced fighters filled the top rows. European interceptors came next. 2 Dutch aircraft were tagged as reserves. Rachel's name appeared nowhere on the slate dot in the control bay. A junior flight commander leaned over a tablet while chewing the corner of his glove. He tapped one column and muttered to a logistics officer beside him. "The Warthog's not air-to-air viable anymore," he said, as if stating the air temperature. "Too slow, too old. The stealth platforms can handle anything that comes through the corridor." Rachel's headset lay coiled on her seat rail. She had already run her auxiliary power unit test that morning, a routine she maintained whether she was flying or not. Her heads-up display blinked dimly to life when she toggled the master switch, pale green outlines tracing familiar arcs across the glass. No one saw it activate. No one asked why she bothered. She wasn't cleared for the intercept exercises. She wasn't logged into the briefing network. Instead, she climbed halfway into her cockpit, knelt on the seat cushion, and flipped open her logbook. The margins were filled with shorthand calculations written in her own hand. Fuel consumption rates, altitude performance curves, turning radii at different weapon loads, wind shift tables, climb thresholds. Not once had she copied data from a computer simulation. Across the ramp, a pair of officers shared a laugh over a mislabeled navigation card. One made a passing joke about mixing up Baltic countries. The other added that Rachel's jet probably ran on coal instead of jet fuel. Neither bothered to look in her direction when they spoke. The sky remained clear and blue, unmarked by the haze that would later complicate radar tracking. But tension began creeping through the base like a slow leak. One of the morning's scheduled aircraft returned early with a diagnostic fault in its navigation system. Another was grounded after reporting pressure irregularities in the nose gear. Assembly. Nothing serious, but timing margins began to narrow. Rachel stepped down from her ladder and checked her fuel gauges again. The tanks were already topped off, as they had been every morning for 3 months. She made a note on her clipboard without looking up, her handwriting steady and precise. Her helmet still hung in the shade of the canopy. She had not touched it yet. At the edge of the command tent, someone pushed open the flap and walked briskly toward the main terminal building. A controller with insignia too new for his uniform stopped mid-stride and tapped his headset twice. He paused, listening intently, then turned to the officer beside him and repeated what he had heard. Possible stealth contact, northeast vector, bearing 340 degrees. The tent felt quieter. Rachel heard the transmission from across the ramp, carried on the morning breeze that would soon shift and complicate everything. She watched as crews froze over their screens, fingers hovering over keyboards that suddenly seemed inadequate for the moment. A mission leader took a long step forward, reaching for his headset with the urgency of someone who had trained for this scenario but never lived it. Names began echoing through the airspace communication network as units scrambled to respond. Rachel reached up and placed one weathered hand against the side of her aircraft. Her fingers brushed the grime-streaked fuselage, feeling the chipped paint around the Thunderchild nameplate. No order had come down for her to prepare, but her cockpit was ready anyway. It had been ready every morning for longer than anyone cared to remember. The mission board updated again, one line at a time, as every available air asset shifted to active status. Every asset except one. Rachel closed her logbook with deliberate care, tucked it into her side pouch, and climbed into her cockpit without speaking to anyone. The heads-up display flickered to steady green, accompanied by the low hum of systems coming online. She sat there with her hands resting calmly on her thighs, headset beside her on the seat rail, waiting for something she had been expecting for a very long time. The alert came softly at first, just a faint scratch of static beneath the routine morning chatter. A radar technician on the early shift repeated the contact under his breath, unsure whether he should trust what his screen was telling him. Then a second trace appeared, sharper this time, approaching from the north-northeast vector at an altitude that seemed to shift in stagger bands. Not fast, not high, just wrong. Inside the control tower, casual conversation died mid-sentence. The relaxed language of peacetime drills vanished, replaced by the clipped urgency of something real happening in real time. One controller raised his headset microphone and began issuing orders with the precision of someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times, but never expected to live it. Two advanced fighters launched within minutes of the alert. The first climbed clean and fast, its nose pointed toward the horizon where trouble might be brewing. The second aborted mid-taxi after reporting a sensor malfunction on its left wing pylon. A reserve aircraft had the range to respond, but was 20 minutes out and holding for aerial refueling. Timing was tight. Available assets were tighter. Rachel Ford stood at the edge of her parking space with her pre-flight checklist still resting on her knee. Her gloves were already on, worn leather that had molded to her hands over 15 years of flying. The last column of her logbook showed handwritten fuel calculations and an altitude performance curve she had plotted without computer assistance. She didn't need to glance down at the numbers. They were committed to memory. The only movement came when she closed the book with one hand and reached for the ladder rungs. She climbed without ceremony, her boots hitting each step with quiet confidence. The maintenance crew across the taxiway noticed her ascending, but said nothing. One looked like he wanted to speak, then decided against it. The ladder creaked under her weight as the morning sun caught the chipped paint on her canopy frame. She swung into the cockpit and dropped into the seat with the fluid motion of someone returning home after a long absence. Inside the aircraft, the temperature was already rising with the day's heat. Her helmet still hung from its hook beside the instrument panel. She took it without hesitation, the black shell feeling properly heavy in her grip. When she locked the visor down, her breathing steadied into the rhythm she had learned in training and perfected in combat. She powered the systems in sequence, not rushed, but exact. battery, inverter, oxygen flow. Internal lights illuminated the instrument panel with subdued intensity. The heads-up display came alive in a muted green arc. Across the front glass, showing altitude, heading, and fuel status with no fancy graphics or advanced overlays. Just the information she needed, displayed clearly. The massive cannon beneath the cockpit floor whirred once as its power systems cycled online. It had not fired in actual combat for years, but the mechanism still turned with mechanical precision. That spoke of proper maintenance and careful storage dot across the airfield. A controller noticed her aircraft's navigation light beginning to blink. His voice went tight with confusion as he keyed his microphone. Unauthorized engines start on the Warthog near maintenance pad 6. A second controller echoed the question, louder this time, with growing concern in his voice. No answer came. From the radio network, Rachel did not respond to their calls. Her hand moved to the throttle controls, gripping the worn handle that had guided her through sandstorms and mountain passes. The throttle moved smoothly in its track, decades of use having worn the mechanism to perfect tolerance. She felt everything. She needed to know through the subtle feedback of metal against metal, hydraulics responding to her touch with the reliability of an old friend. The tower called again, demanding acknowledgement of their transmission. Still no response came from the Warthog. Ground crew stood frozen behind a Danish fighter that had been positioned for routine maintenance. One technician with a clipboard looked toward Rachel's aircraft with obvious confusion. Another raised his hand halfway in a questioning gesture, then stopped when no guidance came from the control tower. No one stepped forward to intervene. No one quite knew what protocol covered this situation. Rachel set her aircraft into motion with deliberate intent. The twin engines spooled up with the heavy thrumming of real mass and power, not the high-pitched whine of modern interceptors, but the rolling weight of machinery built for punishment rather than speed. Heat rippled from the engine nacelles as dust blew off their surfaces. Small pebbles lifted and scattered beneath the main landing gear. Her cockpit remained calm, all systems confirming what she already knew. She was ready. Following the taxi path, she kept to the left side and took the long loop toward the southern end where the runway joined the main strip at a shallow angle. Her airspeed indicator showed 0, but her direction was absolutely final. Her course was set, regardless of what anyone else might think about it. Another radar contact appeared on the control room screens, then a third. The command center filled with static and rising tension as a captain leaned over his console and began coordinating a second launch window. He asked if the air corridor defense systems were adjusting their coverage patterns. The answer came, back terse and worried. 2. Much altitude variation. Not enough sensor overlap. The stealth aircraft were floating through detection gaps in the low-altitude surveillance grid, exploiting exactly the kind of blind spots that modern systems created when they relied too heavily on satellite positioning and computer modeling. Inside her cockpit, Rachel adjusted her trim tabs and pulled her kneeboard into proper position. Her old Afghanistan chart was still folded in the side pocket, but she would not need it today. She was writing this mission plan from memory, using knowledge that had never been entered into any database. The control tower ordered her to stop immediately. She was not cleared for runway entry, not listed on any flight schedule, not acknowledged by any authority that mattered to the people watching her from their glass-walled office above the airfield. Still, she continued rolling forward. Her helmet visor caught the glare off low clouds as she angled left toward the runway threshold. Helmet visor caught the glare off low clouds as she angled left the glare off low clouds as she angled left toward the runway threshold. Her left main wheel crossed the painted boundary line that separated the taxi area from active runway space. The air in her cabin felt focused now. concentrated down to the essential elements of flight and purpose. She toggled her fuel pump to the check position and read out battery voltage levels to herself in a quiet voice. Her right hand moved to the oxygen isolation switch, and the soft hiss in her headset confirmed proper airflow to her mask. Her left heel lifted off the brake pedal. She never looked toward the control tower. In front of her stretched the runway, wide and pale in the morning haze that would soon burn off to reveal crystal clear flying weather. No other aircraft had been cleared for takeoff. No green lights flashed permission from the tower. But she knew this strip like she knew her own heartbeat. She had landed here in crosswinds that bent her wing flaps. She had touched down after flying through storms that turned her windscreen opaque with ice. This runway held no mysteries for her. The cannon spun again beneath her feet. Deeper this time, not armed for combat, not needed for the mission ahead. The sound vibrated through her legs and into her spine, a mechanical heartbeat that reminded her why she had become a pilot in the first place. Her nose wheel aligned with the runway centerline as she applied throttle in graduated increments. The aircraft moved forward as a single unit, heavy and steady and willing to do whatever she asked of it. No authorization came from the radio. No permission was granted. She was airborne in purpose long before her wheels left the ground. Behind her, the silence from the control tower said everything that needed to be said about the moment. When training met reality and found itself wanting, Rachel, Ford's Warthog, cleared the runway without a word of authorization from anyone. Her main landing gear lifted just past the midpoint marker, retracting into their wells with the slow, confident rhythm of machinery that knew its business. The aircraft climbed at a shallow angle, hugging the corridor between ridgeline treetops and the gray ceiling of low-hanging clouds. The sky was hazy with morning moisture that would make modern sensors struggle for clean target locks. Light diffused through the atmosphere in pale gold washes that created exactly the kind of visual confusion that stealth aircraft exploited. The weather conditions that made computer-guided systems hesitate were the same ones that Rachel had learned to read like text on a page. From the control tower, voices crackled through communication channels she had already switched off. One controller demanded to know who had given her launch authorization. Another issued a formal recall order in language that grew sharper with each unanswered transmission. The radio calls bounced uselessly off her aircraft's hull. Rachel wasn't listening. She simply flew. Her flight path ran east by northeast, threading through the low-altitude valley route that cargo aircraft used when weather closed the primary corridors. With her flaps trimmed for maximum efficiency and her wings angled to catch every available updraft, she maintained steady airspeed while the fuselage hummed with the controlled tension of an aircraft being flown within its design limits but close to its maximum potential. The Thunderchild responded to her touch like an extension of memory rather than a collection of mechanical parts. As air pressure built along the control surfaces, small flakes of paint began breaking away from areas where metal fatigue had created hairline stress fractures. Wind hissed through a tiny crack in the canopy seal near her left ear, a sound she had flown with before and could easily ignore. Her radar scope pulsed once, then failed completely. Too much terrain interference at this altitude. Too many blind spots created by hills and valleys that blocked electronic signals. Low-altitude flight in this particular grid reference had always meant flying without electronic assistance. If a pilot couldn't read the terrain by sight and feel, they had no business operating in this environment. Rachel flew by the shape of the Earth itself, not by satellite imagery or computer projections. She banked slightly westward and followed a winding course between hills she recognized by their slope characteristics alone. Intelligence reports suggested the stealth aircraft weren't moving at high speed, which made them far more dangerous than fast-moving interceptors. High-velocity targets created heat signatures and pressure waves that sensors could track. These contacts were moving slowly and deliberately, creeping beneath detection thresholds that had been designed to catch cruise missiles rather than manned aircraft operating with tactical patience. Every second that passed allowed the intruders to penetrate deeper into protected airspace. Every second the advanced fighter aircraft remained grounded or misdirected brought the unknown contacts closer to whatever their objective might be. She descended beneath a shelf of fog that stretched low across the river basin to the north. Thermal imaging equipment lit up her left side display screen, but provided no useful tactical information. The world ahead blurred into translucent gray bands that concealed more than they revealed. Still, she saw what she was looking for. Not a distinct shape or recognizable aircraft profile, but a disturbance in the air itself. A single shimmer against the far ridge line, like heat waves rising from glass where no heat source should exist. The kind of visual anomaly that human eyes could detect but computer systems would dismiss as sensor noise or atmospheric interference. She didn't hesitate or second-guess what her experience was telling her. Rachel rolled into a shallow descent, trimming back pressure on the control stick while maintaining her heading. The Warthog dropped to just above treetop level, close enough that branches stirred in her wake. She came up parallel to the valley wall with her eyes locked on the shimmer that didn't belong. Then a second flicker appeared near the base of the slope, a curve of refracted light that bent too sharply to be natural cloud shadow or morning. There they were. Two stealth aircraft banking slowly in loose formation, nearly level with the ridgeline itself. Their hulls reflected nothing. Their outlines dissolved against the hills behind them like expensive magic tricks designed to fool electronic sensors. But they were there, not because her instruments had detected them, not because of luck or coincidence, but because she remembered how terrain affected airflow and how stealth technology had to obey the same laws of physics that governed every other aircraft. She remembered how aircraft moved when they had to respect gravity instead of relying on computer assistance. Her right hand moved to the master armament switch. The massive cannon beneath her feet spun up with a vibration that rolled through the entire airframe, heavy and alive with mechanical precision. She never moved her finger toward the trigger mechanism. The sound alone was enough to register her presence and intent. Her nose stayed level, altitude locked, as she flew directly beneath the flight path the stealth aircraft had been following. She tracked their probable course by instinct and experience rather than electronic displays, reading the sky itself for clues about where they had been and where they were likely to go next. The first stealth aircraft reacted immediately to the sound of her cannon spinning up. It peeled upward in a hard climbing turn, afterburners not engaged, but moving with the sharp urgency of something that had been discovered, doing what it was not supposed to be doing. The second aircraft cut sharply to the right, choosing rapid altitude gain over continued concealment. Both aircraft moved fast now, but their window of invisibility had closed. They had been forced into the open sky where other sensors could track them, where their stealth advantages became liabilities. In a world of clear sightlines and visual identification, Rachel maintained level flight, her left hand resting easily near the rudder trim controls. Her heads-up display showed nothing useful. Her radar scope remained blank, but she continued watching the sky itself rather than the screens. She banked gently to the left, positioning her aircraft behind the vector. The second stealth contact had taken. No missile lock, no weapons firing, no high-speed pursuit. But her presence was visible now to anyone monitoring the airspace, and visibility was exactly what the stealth aircraft had been trying to avoid. In military doctrine, visibility meant vulnerability, and she had forced both intruders into a position they could not maintain. A faint new echo appeared somewhere ahead of her position, high and brief, then gone again. She didn't turn to pursue it. She understood the tactical situation well enough to recognize a feint when she saw one. A third aircraft might have been present, or the sensor return might have been an electronic ghost created by jamming equipment. She held her course through the narrowing corridor ahead, maintaining altitude at barely 200 feet above ground level, then dropping to 150. Her engines continued running smoothly despite the demanding flight profile. She kept her eyes moving, scanning for any visual anomaly that suggested additional contacts. A flash of reflected sunlight, an unnatural shadow, any shape that didn't belong to the landscape below .9 appeared. After 6 more minutes of systematic searching, the sky began to feel different. Not the light itself, but the pressure and atmosphere of the air around her. The sense of immediate threat diminished as her flight area returned to normal patterns. She adjusted her wing flaps and reduced power to cruise settings. The cannon beneath her feet spun down to idle, its deep humming fading until it disappeared entirely. She toggled the master armament switch to the safe position and engaged the firing mechanism locks. The terrain below held still and peaceful. No movement, no shimmer, no suggestion of hidden aircraft operating where they did not belong. Whatever had come through the protected corridor was now departing it, either climbing to higher altitudes where other defense systems could engage them or retreating entirely from the area. She didn't know where the stealth aircraft would go next, but she knew they had seen her aircraft and registered her capabilities. They would not forget that an old Warthog flown by someone who understood terrain could find them when billion-dollar sensor systems could not. Rachel turned south and climbed slowly into more stable air where the haze brightened and normal cloud formations resumed their familiar patterns. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing unchanged. She checked her oxygen supply, switched to her backup tank as a precaution, and adjusted her trim tabs for the return flight. The control tower said nothing to her over the radio. Her approach vector appeared as a green line on the air traffic control grid, but no voice came through her headset to acknowledge her presence or demand explanations. She didn't ask for permission to return. The descent was smooth and controlled, her flaps extending at precisely the right moment. The ground came up toward her landing gear like something she had done 10,000 times before. She touched down in complete silence. And for the moment at least, the sky above the base remained clear of unwelcome visitors. Rachel's Warthog touched down harder than she would have preferred, but well within acceptable parameters for the aircraft's robust landing gear. The main wheels kissed the tarmac with a sharp bark of tire rubber against concrete, then settled into their familiar rhythm of rollout and deceleration. Dust trails spun behind her wings, caught by the crosswind and carried across the runway in long gray ribbons. The canopy glinted dull and scratched under the overcast light that filtered through morning clouds. The name Thunderchild was now streaked with soot and grime from her low-altitude flight through areas where no aircraft was supposed to operate. She didn't announce her return over the radio. She didn't request clearance or permission for anything. Aircraft simply rolled down the runway like it had never left, like it belonged exactly where it was. One of the ground crew members at Maintenance Pad 6 stood when he saw her wheels touch down, then sat back on his equipment crate without saying anything to his colleagues. Another technician leaned out from under a tow vehicle and squinted into the wind, watching her aircraft taxi past with an expression that mixed curiosity with something approaching respect. The Warthog moved slowly toward her, assigned parking spot, engines at idle power, its weathered hull coated in the profound silence of something that had flown through memory and returned with answers to questions no one had known how to ask. No navigation lights blinked from the control tower. No radio transmissions followed her progress across the airfield. She guided her aircraft into the familiar space beside the maintenance hangar as if it had been assigned to her all along. as if nothing unusual had happened in the past hour. The twin engines gave their last low breath as the turbines wound down to a stop. Rachel released the canopy latch and stood into the cooling air that rushed through the cockpit. Her gloves came off first, placed carefully on the seat cushion. She unlatched her helmet with practiced efficiency, the visor lifting with a soft click that seemed louder than it should have in the sudden quiet. Her face was calm, skin damp with perspiration, eyes steady and focused. She stepped onto the ladder one rung at a time, her boots finding concrete with the solid sound of someone returning from work that mattered. No one spoke immediately. The normal chatter of maintenance crews and ground personnel had faded to whispers and sidelong glances. Then a wrench technician near the corner of the parking area stood upright slowly and raised his right hand. It wasn't a casual wave or greeting. It was a deliberate salute, clean and respectful, held for exactly the right number of seconds. A younger technician nearby followed his lead without hesitation. A third crew chief across the taxiway dropped his wrench, but the sound of it clattering on concrete seemed to echo louder and longer than physics should have allowed. The applause started hesitantly, just a few hands clapping slowly, then spreading, to include more of the ground personnel who had witnessed her unauthorized departure and unannounced return. The rhythm stayed quiet, never loud enough to carry across the entire base, never bold enough to feel like celebration. This wasn't applause for entertainment or ceremony. It was recognition. The kind of acknowledgement people offer when they have seen something they cannot fully explain, but understand enough not to interrupt with questions or demands for official justification. Rachel didn't pause to acknowledge the gesture or wave back at the small crowd that had gathered to watch her. Post-flight routine. She walked beneath her own wing, checked the hydraulic connections at the flap assembly, then wiped a streak of grime away with her thumb. The residue came away black with carbon scoring and atmospheric dust. She nodded once to herself and continued, walking toward the operations building. Inside the flight control center, data recording systems had activated automatically. Her aircraft's telemetry fed into the mission analysis computers without anyone requesting the information. The system had flagged her flight as an unscheduled event requiring immediate review and documentation. Her flight path data projected onto the main briefing wall, showing a ragged but precise corridor through terrain that the standard intercept protocols had classified as impassable for tactical aircraft. Her altitude profile showed elevation changes within 10 feet of known obstacle heights. Her crosswind corrections had compensated for atmospheric conditions, without reference to satellite weather data that hadn't been available at her operating altitude. The briefing room remained quiet as officers and technicians studied the information. One pilot leaned forward to examine the details more closely. A liaison officer from a European air group stood with his arms folded near the back wall, his voice calm and thoughtful when he finally spoke. "They train for speed and electronic superiority," he said quietly. She trained for vision and understanding terrain. No one corrected his assessment or offered alternative explanations. The data playback paused at a critical moment in the flight. Two indistinct silhouettes, blurry and low resolution, appeared in a single frame captured by her heads-up display camera. The computer system didn't classify them as confirmed aircraft contacts, but everyone in the room could see what they represented. Everyone understood the significance of finding stealth aircraft that billion-dollar sensor networks had been unable to locate. A younger pilot stared at the targeting display and asked how she had acquired visual contact with aircraft specifically designed to avoid detection. Another officer noted quietly that her flight path had avoided every standard intercept coordinate in the tactical manual. A third whispered that her engine trim settings had never exceeded normal operational parameters, not even during the sharp banking maneuver near the ravine. where terrain clearance was measured in feet rather than hundreds of yards. Across the parking ramp, a technician from the German air detachment walked slowly up to the Thunderchild's wing and stopped beneath the nose assembly. He raised his tablet computer and took a single photograph of the faded nose art, the weathered paint, and the aircraft that had just accomplished something no one had expected to be possible. No one questioned his actions or asked him to explain his interest in documenting the moment. Rachel sat alone on the wooden bench outside the pilot-ready room, her logbook open in her lap. The final entry showed her airspeed readings, terrain navigation notes, and a handwritten reminder to check engine startup sequences for timing variations. She had not yet filled in the mission summary section. The words for what had happened were still forming themselves in her mind. The door behind her opened, and one of the same fighter pilots who had made jokes about her aircraft weeks earlier stepped outside. He carried a water bottle and a clipboard, walking more slowly than usual. He glanced at her, then at the logbook, then across the tarmac toward the Thunderchild. He said nothing, but his expression had changed from casual dismissal to something approaching professional curiosity. He walked away from the bench with deliberate steps, looking back once before disappearing around the corner of the hangar. Inside the operations center, 2 large display screens showed side-by-side comparison images. One was a live satellite feed of the terrain she had flown through. The other was her hand-drawn navigation chart, scanned and projected for analysis. The terrain lines she had sketched matched the actual topography more precisely than the computer-generated maps. One of her margin notes about wind patterns had accurately predicted atmospheric conditions 12 minutes before the satellite weather system registered the same changes. A senior officer pointed to her handwritten annotation without saying anything, then turned away from the screen with an expression that suggested he was reconsidering assumptions he had held for years about the relationship between technology and human skill. Rachel stood from the bench, tucking her logbook under her arm. She walked slowly back toward her aircraft, where residual heat still rose from the engine compartments. The familiar smell of burned jet fuel and heated metal lingered around the brake assemblies, proof that the machine had been working hard and working properly. A maintenance specialist crouched beside the left main landing gear and looked up at her approach. He didn't smile or offer casual conversation, but he nodded with the kind of respect the mechanics reserve for pilots who bring aircraft home in one piece after doing something genuinely difficult. She returned the gesture, then reached out to brush a streak of dust away from the nose panel with her knuckles. Beneath the grime, bare metal showed clean and bright, proof that under all the wear and fading paint, the aircraft remained fundamentally sound. In the mission debrief facility, an instructor from the advanced fighter program sat alone at a table, replaying her flight footage frame by frame. He paused the recording at the moment her aircraft banked low over the valley, canopy streaked with atmospheric moisture. Nose held perfectly level while terrain rushed past beneath her wings. The stealth aircraft contact shimmered ahead in the distance, too subtle for electronic detection, but visible to someone who knew how to read the sky itself. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, one hand pressed flat against the surface. He spoke to the empty room in a voice barely above a whisper. She flew it like she remembered it before it happened. Outside, the morning was beginning to warm as ground fog lifted from the valleys and normal flight operations resumed their familiar patterns. But something had shifted in the atmosphere on the base, something that had nothing to do with weather or atmospheric pressure, and everything to do with the quiet realization that experience and intuition still mattered in a world increasingly dominated by computer screens and satellite imagery. 3 days passed before Colonel James Richardson called Rachel into his office. The base commander was a career officer who had climbed the ranks during the transition from analog to digital warfare, and he understood both worlds well enough to recognize when something significant had occurred outside normal channels. His office overlooked the main runway where advanced fighters continued their scheduled training exercises. The walls displayed photographs of aircraft that represented 40 years of military aviation evolution. From the Vietnam-era jets he had learned to fly, to the stealth platforms that now dominated strategic planning discussions in Washington. Rachel sat across from his desk in her duty uniform, her flight logbook resting closed on her lap. She had been expecting this conversation since the moment her wheels touched the tarmac after her unauthorized mission. The delay had been longer than she anticipated, which suggested that people with higher clearance levels than Colonel Richardson had been asking questions that required careful answers. "The Pentagon is very interested in your flight profile from Tuesday morning," the colonel said without preliminary small talk. "They want to understand how a single aircraft accomplished something that our most advanced intercept systems failed to achieve." Rachel nodded, but didn't speak immediately. She had learned long ago that superior officers preferred to ask their questions before hearing explanations they might not want to receive. Intelligence analysis confirms that 2 stealth aircraft penetrated our protected airspace using flight patterns specifically designed to exploit gaps in our sensor coverage, Richardson continued. These weren't training exercises or friendly forces conducting unannounced maneuvers. These were actual intrusions by aircraft that shouldn't have been able to operate in this region without detection. He turned his computer monitor so she could see the screen. A map displayed her flight path overlaid with radar tracking data from the morning in question. Her course showed as a solid green line threading through areas marked in red as sensor null zones and detection gaps. "Your route took you through terrain that our tactical computers classified as unsuitable for military aircraft operations," he said. "You maintained visual contact with targets that billion-dollar tracking systems couldn't locate. You forced 2 stealth aircraft to abandon their mission profile and retreat from protected airspace." Rachel opened her logbook and removed a folded paper from the inside cover. She placed it on the colonel's desk and smoothed the creases carefully. The document was a hand-drawn map showing the same terrain features displayed on his computer, but with additional notations written in pencil and red ink. "I've been flying over this terrain for 15 years, she said quietly. "I know where the hills create updrafts that push aircraft higher than they intend to fly. I know where valleys channel wind in ways that make stealth coatings less effective. I know what morning haze looks like when it's being disturbed by jet exhaust." Richardson studied her map, comparing the hand-drawn contour lines to the satellite imagery on his screen. Her annotations matched the computer data with precision. That suggested years of careful observation rather than lucky guessing. "The Defense Department is asking why our most sophisticated aircraft couldn't accomplish what you did alone in a platform they've been trying to retire," he said. "They want to know if this represents a fundamental flaw in our current tactical doctrine." Rachel had been thinking about that question for 3 days. The answer wasn't comfortable for anyone who had invested their career in the belief that newer automatically meant better. Modern systems are designed to process information faster than human pilots can think, she said. But they're processing the wrong information. They're looking for electronic signatures and heat patterns and radar returns. They're not looking at the sky itself. She pointed to a section of her map where pencil marks indicated wind direction changes throughout different times of day. Stealth technology works by controlling what sensors can detect, she continued, but it can't control physics. Aircraft still have to fly through air that moves and shifts and creates patterns. If you know how to read those patterns, stealth becomes less invisible. Richardson leaned back in his chair, considering the implications of what she was telling him. Military doctrine had been moving toward unmanned systems and computer-assisted everything for the past decade. The idea that human observation might be superior to electronic sensors challenged assumptions that had guided billions of dollars in defense spending. "There's going to be a formal review," he said finally. "Pentagon officials want to understand whether your success was repeatable or whether it was a single fortunate incident." Rachel had expected this as well. Military bureaucracy demanded systematic analysis of anything that didn't fit established patterns, especially when that analysis might lead to conclusions that powerful people preferred not to hear. "They're going to want you to duplicate your flight profile using instrumented aircraft and full sensor packages," Richardson continued. "They want to determine whether human pilots can be trained to recognize the visual cues you used, or whether your performance was based on experience that can't be replicated." The question underneath his words was whether she had stumbled onto something genuinely important, or whether she had simply been lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time with skills that couldn't be taught to other pilots. "I can teach what I know," Rachel said, "but it takes time to develop the kind of visual recognition that makes low-altitude terrain flying effective. It's not something you learn from computer simulations or classroom instruction." Richardson nodded slowly. He had flown combat missions himself before becoming an administrator, and he understood the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical skill, developed through years of actual flying experience. "There's something else," he said. "Intelligence sources suggest that the stealth aircraft you encountered were conducting reconnaissance for a larger operation. Your intervention may have disrupted planning for something more significant than a simple airspace violation." Rachel felt her pulse quicken slightly, but her expression remained calm. The possibility that her unauthorized flight had prevented something worse from happening added weight to a situation that was already complicated by questions of military protocol and chain of command. "The review board will want to know whether you were following intuition, or whether you had specific intelligence that suggested stealth aircraft would be operating in that area," Richardson said. "Your answer will determine whether this incident is classified as unauthorized action or as initiative that prevented a security breach." Rachel understood the distinction clearly. Military justice had different standards for pilots who broke regulations to show off versus pilots who broke regulations to protect national security. The difference between those categories would determine whether she faced discipline or commendation. I had no specific intelligence," she said honestly, "but I'd been watching the airspace around this base for months. I knew that our sensor coverage had gaps in the low-altitude corridors. I knew that someone with the right aircraft and flight skills could exploit those gaps if they understood the terrain well enough." Richardson made notes on a pad beside his computer keyboard. His handwriting was precise and economical, the style of someone who had learned to document everything in a profession where details mattered more than impressions. "The investigation will take several weeks," he said. "During that time, you'll continue normal duties, but no unauthorized flights of any kind. Pentagon officials will want to interview you, and they'll want access to your flight logs and navigation materials." Rachel nodded her understanding. She had known that her moment of initiative would lead to scrutiny from people who measured success in terms of following procedures rather than achieving results. "One more thing," Richardson said as she prepared to leave his office. "The European air groups stationed here have been asking questions about your flight techniques. They want to know if American pilots receive training that their pilots don't get." Rachel almost smiled at that observation. The idea that her skills represented some kind of secret American training program rather than individual experience, gained through years of flying aircraft that other countries had retired, was ironic in ways that only she fully appreciated. "They can observe our training exercises if they want," she said. "But what I did Tuesday morning isn't something you learn in training." It's something you develop by flying the same aircraft over the same terrain until you understand both of them well enough to use them together. As she left the colonel's office, Rachel realized that the most difficult part of the investigation wouldn't be explaining what she had done. It would be explaining why her approach to flying had become so unusual that it seemed almost revolutionary to people who had forgotten that aircraft were machines operated by human beings rather than extensions of computer networks. The world had changed around her while she had remained constant. And now that constancy was being examined as if it were innovation rather than simply the persistence of skills that had once been considered fundamental to military aviation. 2 weeks later, Rachel found herself standing in a briefing room filled with officers she didn't recognize, their uniforms bearing insignia from Pentagon intelligence divisions and NATO command structures. The room smelled like coffee and tension, with laptops open on every available surface and screens displaying satellite imagery that covered hundreds of square miles of European airspace. General Patricia Hawkins had flown in from Washington specifically for this demonstration. She was a career fighter pilot who had transitioned to strategic planning, and her reputation for cutting through bureaucratic nonsense to focus on practical results had made her both respected and feared throughout the Air Force command structure. "Captain Ford," the general said, without preliminary introductory remarks, "you're going to show us how you did what billion-dollar sensor systems couldn't do. We've arranged a controlled exercise with friendly aircraft, simulating the same stealth penetration tactics you encountered." Rachel nodded her understanding. She had expected this moment since her conversation with Colonel Richardson. Military doctrine demanded proof that successful tactics could be repeated and taught to other personnel, rather than being dependent on individual skills that couldn't be systematized. 2 friendly stealth aircraft will attempt to penetrate the northern corridor using the same flight profiles intelligence analysis suggests the original intruders employed. General Hawkins continued, "Our standard intercept systems will be active, along with additional sensor platforms brought in specifically for this exercise." The briefing room fell quiet as she gestured toward a large screen showing the exercise area. Red zones marked areas where electronic surveillance systems maintained coverage. Yellow areas indicated partial sensor overlap. White spaces showed gaps in detection, capability that could potentially be exploited by aircraft flying at specific altitudes and speeds. Your mission is to locate and visually identify the penetrating aircraft using the same techniques you employed during the original incident, the general said. You'll be accompanied by an observer pilot in a 2-seat trainer aircraft, and both aircraft will carry full instrumentation to record everything you do. Rachel understood the subtext clearly. This wasn't just a demonstration of her flying skills. This was a test to determine whether her success had been based on reproducible techniques, or whether it had been an unrepeatable combination of luck and individual experience that couldn't be transferred to other pilots. The observer aircraft will record your visual scanning patterns, flight path decisions, and communication with ground control, General Hawkins continued. If your techniques prove effective, we'll develop training protocols to teach them to pilots operating advanced aircraft that might benefit from supplementing electronic systems with human observation skills. An hour later, Rachel walked across the tarmac toward her aircraft with a different kind of nervous energy than she had felt in years. Flying alone on an unauthorized mission had been scary but straightforward. Flying under observation while being evaluated by people who could reshape military aviation doctrine was a different kind of pressure entirely. Her Warthog sat in its familiar position, but now it was surrounded by equipment she had never seen before. Technicians had mounted additional camera systems on the wings and fuselage. Sensor packages that normally equipped research aircraft had been installed to monitor her flight controls, engine settings, an aircraft attitude throughout the mission. The Observer aircraft was a modern two-seat trainer with electronic systems that could record and transmit real-time data to ground stations. Its pilot was Major Kevin Thompson, a test pilot from Edwards Air Force Base who specialized in evaluating new tactical procedures for potential adoption throughout the Air Force. "I'll follow your lead and stay out of your way," Thompson said during their pre-flight briefing. "My job is to document what you're doing and how you're doing it, not to second-guess your decisions or offer suggestions." Rachel appreciated his straightforward approach. Some observer pilots tried to participate in missions rather than simply recording them, which created complications that made evaluation more difficult. "The key is reading the air itself rather than relying on instruments," she told him. "Modern sensors are looking for specific signatures. Human eyes can detect patterns and anomalies that don't register on electronic systems." They launched together, her Warthog climbing slowly while the observer aircraft maintained a parallel course 500 feet higher and 1 mile to her right. The morning conditions were similar to those during her original unauthorized flight. Hazy air that would challenge electronic sensors while providing the kind of atmospheric conditions where stealth aircraft could operate most effectively. Rachel's approach was methodical rather than intuitive this time. She had to explain her decision-making process over the radio for the benefit of people monitoring the exercise from ground stations, which meant verbalizing thought patterns that had become automatic after years of experience. "Descending to 200 feet above terrain," she reported. "Haze level is creating thermal layers that will distort radar returns. Stealth aircraft will try to use these layers for concealment." She guided her aircraft through the same low-altitude corridor she had flown weeks earlier, but this time she described what she was looking for and why specific terrain features mattered for detecting aircraft that were designed to avoid detection. "Banking left toward the ridgeline," she continued. "Valley winds create updrafts that will push aircraft higher than intended flight paths. Looking for atmospheric disturbances that suggest jet exhaust mixing with natural air currents." The observer aircraft followed her course while its pilot documented her flight techniques and transmitted real-time data to the evaluation team on the ground. Major Thompson's voice remained calm and professional as he described her flying style. "For the permanent record, subject to aircraft maintaining precise altitude control in challenging terrain," he reported. "Pilot is using visual references rather than electronic navigation aids. Flight path appears to be based on terrain analysis rather than predetermined coordinates." Rachel smiled slightly at his clinical description of flying techniques that felt as natural to her as walking. The formality was necessary for official documentation, but it made her approach sound more complicated than it actually was. "Contact," she said suddenly, her voice sharpening with focus. "Atmospheric disturbance bearing 270 degrees. Distance approximately 3 miles. Looks like jet exhaust mixing with natural haze patterns." She banked toward the disturbance, while Major Thompson strained to see what had caught her attention. Through his aircraft's advanced optics, the area she was indicating looked like empty sky with normal atmospheric conditions. "I don't see anything on visual or electronic sensors," he reported to the ground stations. "Subject pilot is pursuing a contact that our systems haven't detected." Rachel descended another 50 feet and adjusted her heading based on subtle changes in air clarity that suggested the presence of aircraft operating nearby. Her instruments showed nothing unusual, but her eyes were tracking patterns in the atmosphere that had learned to associate with stealth, aircraft attempting to remain hidden. "There," she said over the radio. 2 aircraft in loose formation, maintaining ridgeline altitude, banking to maintain visual contact. This time, Major Thompson saw them. 2 dark shapes against the hillside, visible for just a moment before atmospheric conditions concealed them again. His aircraft's electronic systems registered brief sensor returns that disappeared almost immediately. Confirmed visual contact with 2 aircraft, he reported. Electronic systems show intermittent returns consistent with stealth technology. Subject pilot acquired targets using visual observation techniques alone. The demonstration continued for another 20 minutes as Rachel tracked the friendly aircraft through terrain that challenged every electronic system in the area. She maintained visual contact by reading atmospheric patterns that revealed aircraft presence even when stealth technology defeated radar and infrared sensors. When they landed, General Hawkins was waiting beside the runway with an expression that suggested the demonstration had provided answers to questions she had been asking for months. "That was remarkable," she said as Rachel climbed down from her aircraft. "You found them consistently using techniques that our most advanced pilots haven't been taught." Rachel pulled off her helmet and ran her fingers through hair damp with perspiration from the intense concentration required to fly and teach simultaneously. "It's not remarkable," she said quietly. "It's just flying the way pilots flew before we started trusting computers more than our own senses." General Hawkins studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly as if she had reached a conclusion that would require significant changes in how the Air Force thought about pilot training and tactical doctrine. "We need to talk," she said. "There are implications here that go far beyond a single incident with stealth aircraft." As they walked toward the debriefing facility, Rachel realized that her unauthorized flight had accomplished something she never intended. It had demonstrated that human skills developed through experience could supplement or even surpass technological capabilities that had been considered superior to anything individual pilots could achieve. The question now was whether military leadership would be willing to modify training programs and tactical doctrine to incorporate techniques that couldn't be reduced to computer algorithms or standardized procedures. 6 months after Rachel's unauthorized flight, the morning briefing at Ramstein Air Base had changed in ways that would have seemed impossible to imagine before stealth aircraft began operating in European airspace with impunity. The operations center buzzed with familiar efficiency, but the conversations were different now, focused on integration of human observation skills with electronic sensor systems rather than relying exclusively on computer-generated tactical data. Rachel stood at the front of the briefing room, no longer the forgotten pilot relegated to obsolete aircraft and maintenance duties. The weathered flight suit had been replaced by instructor's insignia, and her logbook had become the foundation for a new training program that pilots from 12 NATO countries had come to learn. "Visual terrain analysis," she said to a room filled with pilots flying aircraft worth more than some nations' entire defense budgets, "starts with understanding that stealth technology can defeat sensors, but it can't defeat physics." The audience included 2 German pilots who flew advanced interceptors, a Dutch squadron leader who specialized in electronic warfare, and a French test pilot who had been sent specifically to evaluate whether Rachel's techniques could be adapted for their newest stealth aircraft. All of them carried notebooks and asked questions that suggested they were taking the instruction seriously rather than treating it as an academic curiosity. Modern sensor systems look for specific signatures. Rachel continued, gesturing toward a topographical map that showed the terrain where her original unauthorized flight had taken place. Heat patterns, radar returns, electronic emissions. But aircraft still have to move through air that behaves according to predictable physical laws. A young pilot flying an advanced fighter raised his hand. "How do you distinguish between atmospheric disturbance caused by stealth aircraft and natural weather patterns?" Rachel smiled at the question, remembering when she'd been dismissed for asking similar questions about the limitations of electronic systems that were supposed to make human observation obsolete. "Experience," she said simply. "You learn to Recognize the difference between natural air movement and artificial disturbance, the same way you learn to recognize the difference between engine noise that sounds normal and engine noise that suggests mechanical problems developing. The briefing room fell quiet as pilots who had been trained to trust computer displays more than their own senses considered the implications of relearning skills that many of them had never been taught in the first place. General Hawkins entered the room quietly and took a seat in the back, her presence indicating that what had started as an investigation into an unauthorized flight had evolved into something with strategic implications for military aviation throughout NATO. The integration of human observation with electronic systems, Rachel continued, doesn't mean abandoning technology. It means using technology to enhance human capabilities rather than replace them. She gestured toward a screen showing her aircraft's flight path overlaid with sensor data from the demonstration exercise that had convinced Pentagon officials to fund a new training program. The combination of visual tracking and electronic confirmation had provided more reliable target acquisition than either approach could achieve independently. Pilots flying advanced aircraft have sensor capabilities I never dreamed of having, she said. But those sensors work best when they're directed by human observation that can recognize patterns computers aren't programmed to detect. A NATO observer from Belgium asked about the time required to develop the visual recognition skills that made terrain following effective against stealth aircraft. The question reflected practical concerns about training schedules and resource allocation that would determine whether Rachel's techniques could be implemented on a scale large enough to matter strategically. It takes time, Rachel admitted. Honestly, but not as much time as you might think. Most pilots already have the basic skills. They just need permission to trust what they're seeing instead of waiting for electronic confirmation of everything they observe. After the briefing, Rachel walked across the airfield toward a sight that still surprised her every morning. 5 aircraft sat in formation beside the main hangar, including her Warthog, but now accompanied by modern fighters that had been modified to carry both advanced sensors and the hand-drawn terrain maps that had become standard equipment for pilots trained in visual recognition techniques. The Thunderchild looked different now. Not because anything fundamental had changed about the aircraft, but because it was no longer treated as an obsolete relic waiting for retirement. Fresh paint covered the nose art, and maintenance crews worked on the aircraft with the same attention they devoted to billion-dollar stealth platforms. Major Thompson, the test pilot who had observed her demonstration flight, approached carrying a tablet displaying exercise results from the past week. His expression suggested good news, but Rachel had learned to be cautious about celebrating success too early in military environments where policy changes could reverse previous decisions without warning. Pilot retention in the new training program is running at 97%, he reported. More importantly, pilots are requesting extension of training time rather than trying to complete the minimum requirements and move on to other assignments. Rachel nodded, but remained focused on practical results rather than administrative statistics. The ultimate test of the program would be whether pilots could successfully apply visual recognition techniques during actual tactical situations rather than controlled training exercises. Combat effectiveness data will be more important than training completion rates, she said. We need to know whether pilots can find and engage stealth aircraft under operational conditions, rather than just recognizing them during demonstrations. Thompson scrolled to another section of his tablet, showing performance metrics that addressed exactly the concerns she had raised. Simulated combat exercises show 40% improvement in target acquisition when visual techniques are combined with electronic sensors, he said. That's consistent across different aircraft types and pilot experience levels. The number was significant enough to justify the resources being invested in the program, but Rachel remained focused on the individual pilots who would ultimately determine whether the new training approach succeeded or failed in real-world applications. That afternoon, she sat beneath the wing of her aircraft with her original logbook open on her lap, reviewing notes she had written years before anyone considered visual terrain analysis to be strategically important. The margins were still filled with handwritten calculations about wind patterns and atmospheric conditions that had seemed irrelevant when military. Doctrine emphasized electronic superiority over human observation. A young pilot approached, carrying a notebook and wearing the flight suit of the new integrated training program. Her name was Lieutenant Jennifer Brooks, and she flew an advanced interceptor that represented everything Rachel's Warthog was supposed to have been replaced by years ago. "I wanted to thank you," Lieutenant Brooks said without preliminary conversation. "The visual recognition training changed how I think about flying entirely." Rachel looked up from her logbook, curious about the specific ways that traditional flying skills were affecting pilots, who had learned to operate aircraft that could almost fly themselves. "Before this training, I was basically a systems manager," Brooks continued. "I monitored displays and responded to computer-generated recommendations. Now I feel like I'm actually flying the aircraft instead of just riding along with it." Rachel smiled at the observation, remembering her own frustration with the gradual replacement of piloting skills with computer operation during the years, when military aviation moved toward full automation and electronic assistance. "The computers are still there to help," Rachel said, "but now you're using them as tools instead of letting them use you as backup systems." Lieutenant Brooks nodded and opened her notebook to show pages filled with hand-drawn terrain maps and margin notes about atmospheric conditions that affected stealth aircraft detection. Her handwriting was neat and precise, but the content was unmistakably personal rather than copied from standardized training materials. "I've been practicing the visual scanning techniques over different terrain types," she said. "Each area has its own patterns for how air moves and how aircraft disturbances show up against natural conditions." Rachel examined the younger pilot's notes with approval. The training program was working exactly as intended, teaching pilots to develop individual expertise rather than relying exclusively on standardized procedures that could be applied universally regardless of local conditions. "The key is patience," Rachel said. "Electronic systems provide immediate feedback. Visual recognition takes time to develop, but it provides information that computers can't process." As the sun began setting over the airfield, Rachel closed her logbook and stood to perform a final inspection of her aircraft. The routine hadn't changed in 15 years, but the context was completely different now. Her Warthog was no longer the forgotten aircraft at the end of the flight line. It was the training platform for pilots' learning skills that had become strategically important for maintaining air superiority in an era when stealth technology was proliferating beyond the control of any single military force. The evening briefing that night included a video conference with Pentagon officials who were considering expansion of the visual recognition training program to air bases throughout Europe and Asia. The success at Ramstein had demonstrated that human observation skills could provide tactical advantages that justified the time and resources required to develop them properly. Rachel listened to the discussion about implementation, schedules, and resource allocation, but her attention remained focused on the pilots who would ultimately determine whether the program succeeded in operational environments. Statistics and policy decisions mattered, but individual skills developed through practice and experience would determine whether stealth aircraft could continue operating with impunity in contested airspace. Later that night, she walked alone across the airfield under stars that were clear enough to navigate by if electronic systems ever failed completely. The Thunderchild sat quietly beside the hangar, its engines cold but ready for whatever tomorrow might require. For the first time in years, Rachel felt like she was exactly where she belonged, knew exactly what she had been trained to do. Her unauthorized flight had become the foundation for changes that would affect military aviation for decades to come. But more importantly, pilots were learning to trust their own senses again, to see the sky itself rather than just the information displayed on computer screens. The future of air combat would still involve advanced technology and electronic systems that could process information faster than human brains could analyze it. But that future would also include pilots who understood that the most sophisticated computers in the world couldn't replace the human ability to recognize patterns, adapt to unexpected situations, and make decisions based on experience that couldn't be programmed into any software. Rachel had never intended to revolutionize military aviation doctrine. She had simply flown her aircraft the way she had always flown it, using skills she had developed through years of practice in conditions that had taught her to trust her own observations over electronic displays that could be fooled by technology, designed specifically to defeat them. Now those skills were being taught to pilots flying aircraft she could never have imagined. When she first learned to fly, the integration of human observation with advanced electronic systems was creating capabilities that neither approach could achieve independently. As she reached her quarters, Rachel realized that her story had become larger than her individual experience. It had become proof that innovation sometimes meant remembering skills that had been forgotten rather than developing technology that had never existed before. The sky above Ramstein Air Base remained as clear and readable as it had always been. The difference was that pilots were learning to read it again, combining the wisdom of experience with the power of modern technology to create air superiority that could adapt to any challenge. Rachel Ford had forced 2 stealth aircraft to retreat, using nothing but her eyes, her experience, and an aircraft that military planners had written off as obsolete. Now, her approach was becoming the standard for pilots flying the most advanced aircraft in the world. Sometimes, the old ways weren't just better than new ones. Sometimes they were exactly what the future needed to become reality. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.